Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. By way of introduction, my name is Anindya Ghosh Chaudhary. I am a director in Forvis Mazars, and I look after the Prudential Risk and Regulation team. Today, we are going to talk about solvent exit planning. As you know, the rules about the solvent exit planning were communicated by the PRA as the part of SS 224, and they're aimed at non-systemic banks and building societies. As you would also know, there is a requirement to prepare the solvent exit analysis in BAU, i.e. now, and a solvent exit execution plan, or the SEEP, at such time when solvent exit becomes quite likely. Now, the requirement to build the SEA comes into effect on the 1st of October 2025. So you might as well ask, why are we talking about it now? Firstly, because it's never too early to talk about regulatory change. And secondly, I'm hoping that as we go through the webinar, you'll identify that there are a number of requirements within the solvent exit analysis that will require firms to, firms will take time to implement that and to think through those in order to build a plan that withstands regulatory scrutiny. We're also on LinkedIn Live, and this session is being recorded. But please do keep your questions coming in through the chat box on Zoom or as part of your comments on LinkedIn Live. In this webinar, we are going to cover three main things before moving on to Q&A. Firstly, we're going to cover the main areas of focus in the solvent exit analysis. So areas that you might need to start thinking about now so that you're in a good state to comply with all the requirements on day one. Secondly, we're going to talk about the solvent exit execution plan in a little bit more detail. The key question that we'll be looking to discuss here is whether it might be worth for you to start thinking about preparing the solvent exit execution plan in parallel with the solvent exit analysis, despite the requirement of the SEEP not coming into force until such time when solvent exit is likely. And we'll go through the reasons for that also. And finally, we are going to talk about how firms can prepare to comply with day one requirements for the solvent exit analysis. We expect this presentation from us to last for about 30 minutes. And at the end of that, there will be Q&A. So we will definitely cover the questions that you send in through the chat box and the LinkedIn comments, and we'll hope to answer any questions that way in this webinar. But if we do run out of time and we aren't able to answer any questions in the allocated time, we'll ensure that we get back to you with any unanswered questions. On that note, I'd like to introduce you to my colleagues, Freddie and Aji, who will be delivering this presentation alongside me. Freddie?
Hi everyone, so my name's Freddie Blake. I work alongside Anindya in the Prudential Risk team here at Forvis Mazars. I've been here for about 2 years. Prior to that, worked at the Bank of England, spent around 6 years in supervision and spent a number of those years focusing in particular on recovery and resolution.
Thank you, Freddie. And Aji?
Hello everyone, my name is Aji. I'm an assistant manager in the banking risk team. I've been with Forvis Mazars for about 18 months now. And before that, I spent time at a big four and then a bank, basically focusing on prudential risk and regulatory reporting.
Thank you very much, Freddie, and thank you very much, Aji, for your introduction. So in the interest of time, let's go straight into it. So Freddie, what in your view are the main constituents of the SEA? And which areas do you think would require the most attention from firms?
Thanks, Anindya. So what I'm going to do is I'll just start off by giving a quick overview of all of the main sections associated with solvent exit analysis. And then as we go through the webinar, we'll go into a little bit more detail in some of the most important sub-elements associated with solvent exit analysis. So just to get us started, there are basically 7 sections of solvent exit analysis requirements. So one, you've got the requirement around solvent exit actions. And so here firms can incorporate existing recovery options, but some of the additional actions to consider that are solvent exit specific could involve things like deposit transfer to other entities or deposit repayment. Second, you've got the requirement for solvent exit indicators, and I'm going to get onto this in a bit more detail shortly. Third, you've got the expectation around identification of barriers and risks. And in particular, what the regulator is looking for here is for firms to identify specific idiosyncratic, so firm-specific obstacles to solvent exit. Fourth, you've got the resources and costs that are needed to execute a solvent exit, and I'll cover that in a bit more detail shortly as well. You've got the need for a communication plan, and here again, I think that firms may leverage existing communication frameworks under recovery and resolution planning. Six, you've got the requirements around governance and decision making, identifying the decision makers and the governance process involved in solvent exit. And finally, seventh, you've got assurance, and here firms have the option to implement an internal or external assurance process for solvent exit to support them. So that's a kind of overview of the different elements of solvent exit analysis. In my view, there are some areas that are a bit more straightforward, others that require more attention. I'm just going to quickly start with an area that's more straightforward, just to highlight it, the degree to which there is an overlap between solvent exit and pre-existing regulatory guidance. And this is around something that's more straightforward, like I said, that's solvent exit indicators. So here, we think that the solvent exit indicator framework should broadly carry on from existing recovery plan indicators, and the philosophy should be broadly similar. And speaking of recovery plan indicators, there's been some new regulatory guidance from the PRA, and many of you on the call will be aware of that Dear CEO letter on recovery planning that was published on the 15th of May, so just over a month ago. And that goes a long way to sort of establishing the PRA's current thematic focus areas for recovery planning. And to me, there were two main focus areas stemming from that Dear CEO letter. One was a focus on ensuring firms have severe enough scenarios to challenge the viability of their business model. It's something that the regulator's been banging the drum for some time now. It's something that we've noticed firms are failing to do when we do our own reviews of recovery plans for clients. And then second, the PRA was focused around ensuring that firms are better able to calculate their recovery capacity effectively and provide a clear analysis of recovery capacity in their recovery plan. Now, given the degree of overlap between recovery planning and solvent exit, I think that firms should draw the feedback from this Dear CEO letter and identify the thematic areas of focus from the regulator going forward and reflect it in their approach to solvent exit. Because the chances are these kind of areas that the regulator is focusing on for recovery, they're probably going to be focusing on for solvent exit when they come to start reviewing your solvent exit plans. So overall, those solvent exit indicators, they should be forward-looking, and they should also critically enable sufficient time to prepare a solvent exit execution plan. Now, having said all that about the similarities, there are a few key differences that we've identified between solvent exit indicators and recovery indicators. So in particular, solvent exit indicators, I think, are relatively softer than the recovery indicators. So solvent exit doesn't become mandatory once they're breached. But what breaches of solvent exit indicators should do is ideally trigger the need for key governance committees to convene with a view for undertaking further analysis on the next course of action. So that's the sort of one element that's a bit more of an easier part, frankly. But there are some elements of the solvent exit analysis where we think expectations are more complex. For instance, computing resources and costs or identifying barriers and risks. And I think we're going to delve into that as we go through the webinar now. Oh, sorry, and India, it looks like
Sorry.
you're
Yes, we're out of COVID, but still grappling with technology. Apologies for that. But I was just thanking you for that intro on solvent exit indicators, and I agree that there is a lot of common ground over there between recovery and solvent exit indicator frameworks. But obviously, the outcome of recovery is revival, whereas that's not the case for solvent exit, as we know. So the nature of actions that follow the indicators, as you very well pointed out, are quite different. But the framework remains the same. So talking about the more complex areas, Freddie, so let's start with resources and costs. What do you think are the main pinch points here?
So just to start off, so I was talking in my previous answer around there was a degree of linkage between recovery and solvent exit. Here I'm going to come at a slightly different angle and point out there is a degree of linkage between existing wind down requirements and solvent exit. So we've costed a number of wind down plans before, and we've also spoken about this matter with the regulator, and that's going to inform some of the takeaways that I'm going to provide in responding to expectations around resources and costs. But fundamentally, the expectation is that firms are going to need to be pretty thorough in identifying the avenues that could lead to costs. They're going to have to develop a reasonable approach to come up with an estimated number. And there are a couple of key areas in particular that I think firms are going to need to focus on. So one is around sources of cost and identifying the most significant sources of cost from a solvent exits perspective specifically. And these can fall at the moment, at a high level into two categories in particular that I've going to point out. One is around staff costs, which is fairly obvious, and that's some of the variables at play here could be, for example, who you're going to decide to retain, who you're going to let go, what does retention look like, what do the redundancy costs look like, how does the benefits unwind play out. Some of the more technical elements that could crop up for solvent exit specifically may include, what staff support is provided by any legacy or new entity going forward that controls pensions or other benefits after the bank has exited the market. And then the second significant source of costs, in my opinion, again, quite a broad category, is around operational costs. So that could be, the breaking of contracts. It could be, for example, the breaking of rental agreements at premises. It could be the need for professional support through the solvent exit process. And it can also be the absorption of haircuts. And I'm just going to go into a little bit more detail on haircuts because I think that is quite an important element of any cost relating to solvent exit. And here, the quantum of any firm's haircut is going to vary a lot. And so it could be dependent on whether business is being transferred or outright sold, whether a sale is taking place in a primary or secondary market, and of course, the market's prevailing appetite to buy. And that's one of the most important considerations that will need to be taken into account, is whether or not firms are going to be enacting a solvent exit in a stressed market versus an exit that is a result of idiosyncratic factors. Because obviously, if you're going in a solvent exit scenario that's as the result of idiosyncratic factors in more benign market conditions, then this is probably going to result in smaller haircuts and less exceptional costs as a consequence to the bond portfolio, the loan book, whatever it may be that you're looking to unwind or sell off before you finalize your solvent exit. So haircuts is an important sub-element of sources of costs that firms will need to think about. One of the areas that we've noticed the regulator likes to really drill down into when it comes to wind down planning, and there will be a read across here into solvent exit, is the key is costing that is based off clear financials. So clear costing is really important. Costing that's adequately researched and computed on a really granular basis. So for example, here, two of the clients that we've helped recently around wind down planning received really positive feedback from the regulator on the fact that their wind down plans stem from actual numbers and that they were costed to the penny. So it's something that firms will need to ensure that they provide that adequate detail in their solvent exit analysis. And then finally, as well, something that the regulator is constantly on the lookout for is detail around staff numbers and resourcing through the solvent exit. And the focus there often from the regulator is that the resources are sufficient to provide a degree of contingency throughout the process. And so what firms will often do is produce something that may not have the necessary redundancies built in to the regulator's liking. And as always, contingency is something that may increase costs. So it's something that firms will need to be wary of. Now, in my opinion, a lot of this may look like we're straying into the territory of the solvent exit execution plan itself. But this actually looks like the level of detail that the regulator is going to expect in a solvent exit analysis document. Now, there is, of course, some help at hand. So, for example, firms should be already running, systemic and idiosyncratic stress testing for ICAP, ILAP, recovery plan, resolution planning even. And that can be obviously used as the basis for some of the solvent exit analysis, in particular around haircuts and selling assets into distressed market and what those market conditions may look like. But by and large, under this sub-element of solvent exit analysis, it looks like there'll be quite a lot of detailed work that needs to be done.
That's very interesting. Thank you, Freddie. And obviously, one of the things that can either that can impact the quantum of wind down costs quite significantly is perhaps the extent to which some of the risks around wind down and the barriers to the effective implementation of a solvent exit plan has been mitigated. So that perhaps is a good segue into the next area of complexity that you outlined in your introduction. So Aji, with barriers and risks in mind, what are the main areas that you think leaps in the front of your mind with regard to what firms need to think about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question in India. So encouragingly, Box B in Supervisory Statement 224 provides invaluable information that firms can leverage when assessing and identifying potential risks and barriers in the business. Like Freddie mentioned earlier, staffing is a near and present need for firms. And so if we flip this to the other part of it, yeah, there's a risk that firms are unable to retain staff in the right area to meet business needs and solvent exit when it becomes a reality. And so there's a need for firms to assess the possibility that they do not retain these staff and then the risk that would stem from this occurring. There's also the need for firms to determine their approach to customer management. So it's quite normal that firms would end up with uncontactable or untraceable customers. So there's a need for them to determine the necessary action that will be taken to mitigate this risk and to reduce this barrier. Off the top of my head, I foresee firms basically starting to contact customers and basically updating this customer information as the case may be. Then there is the bank run that is an unintended consequence of poor communication. This is important because if and when word gets out and there's a deposit run, then the entire mathematics of solvent exit, of your solvent exit analysis becomes redundant. And when I say the entire mathematics, I mean costing and then the resource requirement, as well as the projections that the firm has made regarding capital, funding, and liquidity. And so it is important for firms to recognize this risk and begin to address it sooner rather than later, so that eventually it is easier to justify the entire assumptions and judgments that support your solvent exit analysis and the entire computation around solvent exit execution plan. I also think that banks would need to, first of all, understand the legal and corporate complexities around their business and then figure out how to unwind these. For example, what are you going to do with your employee contracts, like Freddie had mentioned earlier? What are you going to do with your third-party contracts? How do you treat your contingent exposures? And I think that this is where the legal department of the different institutions would come in to sort of support this process. And the expectation is that a lot of the learnings from your solvent exit analysis, you carry on into BAU on how you treat these contracts. And then another part would be assessing the substitutability of your services. And now this might not this might not cut across a lot of the institutions and might only be particular to institutions that offer niche services like faith-based banking, or you provide payment services to institutions. There's a need to understand the possibility of transferring your clients from your institution to another institution when solvent exit becomes a reality. And in my opinion, there are 4 critical steps that institutions can begin to take that would represent best practice. Number 1 would be identifying and quantifying, where possible, the risk and the barriers to your business. The next bit will be outlining how you intend to address these risks and barriers to ensure that obviously solvent exit is a seamless process. The next bit as well would be identifying any residuals. So residuals in terms of factors that you cannot either manage or mitigate, and then you determine if you want to accept them or to transfer them. And then the final bit would be assessing the impact of these residuals on your ability to effectively exit the market. Overall, I think that solvent exit has to be done in an agile and fluid manner. As a matter of fact, some of our clients have indicated interest in pursuing solvent exits over the next couple of months. a lot more others have indicated interest in doing this into the new year. And so it's important to start to pay attention to these critical elements. What are you going to do about your uncontactable customers? What are you going to do about your contingent exposures? How do you treat your contracts? How do you manage your third-party relationships? And what happens if you need external support? These are some of the factors that I think that firms need to start to pay attention to. Does this help?
Thanks, Ajay. And indeed, how do you contain, the information, about going into, forced exit, from the market, which, as you said, could lead to a depositor run and change the mathematics, as you say, of solvent exit. So, thank you, Ajay, for that very in-depth, explanation on barriers and risks. And I agree that Box B, in SS24 is a very good platform for firms to consider and start thinking about some of these things as they, tackle the requirements of solvent exit analysis. Finally, Freddie, the last item that you mentioned to be an area of complexity and requiring focus in the context of the SEA is indeed the communication plan. What are the main points that you draw out there?
Yeah, I mean, the communication plan is obviously, when push comes to shove, always extremely important. So what I've basically done here is, from a solvent exit analysis, taken a step back and basically set out, I think, that there are 4 key elements that firms need to define. And so one is around the stakeholders. And so from a communication perspective, firms need to identify who are the external and internal stakeholders that need to be engaged during the solvent exit process. And the internal stakeholders is relatively straightforward. It's probably going to be firm employees. More sophisticated firms or international firms, there might be consideration around group as well, which brings an element of complexity to this. But the more interesting element of identification of stakeholders is around those external stakeholders, because you've got a lot more variety here. You may have stakeholders in the regulator, you may have shareholders, you may have clients, debtors, creditors, outsourced service providers, or other counterparties. So that's step one, is identifying who those stakeholders are that you need to get in contact with. Step 2 is around timing. So what are the timing of the communications, and in particular before initiation and during and after initiation of any solvent exit. So as always, timings are going to be one of the most important elements of any communication plan to ensure that it's actually viable in practice. And one of the big things that firms are probably going to need to consider is how long it will take external stakeholders to digest and respond to information, and factor that into their communication timings. So that's 2, timing. 3, we've got objective. So what is the objective of the communication? What is the key message of the communication? Who's the communication for, and what purpose does it serve? In instances like this, when it comes to things that are obviously quite severe, that are resulting in solvent exit, the communication really has to be concise and clear. And finally, 4th, we've got responsibilities. So who's in charge of what during the communication process? And I think normally industry, best practice here would be around drawing up a responsibility assignment matrix. And so you can split it up into 4 different sort of subsections that I've just gone through: stakeholders, timing, objective, and responsibility. And I think those are the 4 elements from a communication perspective that firms are going to need to focus on. Now, just one thing to add is that some supervisors may recommend, and this is in keeping with recovery and resolution planning, that they may want to test, your communication plan, or may want you to test your communication plan and wider solvent exit analysis through fire drill exercise. And this is the current expectation every 3 years, I think, set out in it's SS 917, isn't it? There are so many supervisory statements flying around these days. But realistically, I think if your assurance is good, you don't have to spend any more time and cost to do that. And I don't think it's actually required by the guidance set out by the PRA. So yeah, that was everything on communication plans. I think we're going to do a slight change of tone here it's the election is on, so I'm looking forward to my opportunity to become the paxman, and I'm going to start asking some questions of an India. And just to get us started, to flip the script slightly, in India, I've already referenced the fact that it looks like a pretty detailed set of expectations. I think I mentioned this when I was talking about resourcing and costs. And so something that I'm pretty sure a lot of people on the webinar are going to be interested in is, we've spoken a lot about solvent exit analysis. Where exactly does the solvent exit execution plan come into play?
Thank you, Freddie, and I'm completely okay with that change of tone as long as you don't threaten to overrule me. But going on to the solvent exit analysis, the solvent exit execution plan, and the overlaps between them, I think and I hope that what you would have identified from what we have presented today is that there's actually a great deal of overlap between the SEA and what you might be expected to do as a part of the SEEP. So let's take staff costs, for example. As a part of as a part of the ACA, you have to identify what are your critical services that you need to keep going or keep running during solvent exit. You need to identify who are the critical staff. You need to come up with estimations for redundancy payments. You need to come up with estimations for retention payments, so on and so forth. So in computing the staff costs element of the time and resources requirement of solvent exit analysis, you're already going into a lot of detail, and this detail is what is required under the solvent exit execution plan. So, that's just one of the examples where, a lot of what you're required to do later on is already being done at present. Let's take another example. So let's take the communication plan that, Aji spoke about. Now, in order to come up with perhaps a reasonable estimation of the quantum of risks, or the proverbial height of the barriers to solvent exit, you would need to contain the news of the solvent exit, or your exit from the market. And for that, you need to come up with controls around how to contain your internal communications around that prospect, so that you don't disrupt the external environment that could potentially lead to a depositor run. And again, to think about that, you need to you need to undertake quite deep analysis to identify the controls, identify who are the stakeholders, what the nature of the communication is, how to not sound alarmist, what your response to the market would be in the event that there is leakage and there is a risk of a depositor run. So you're already going into a lot of detail on the communications plan as a part of the SEA, which you are not required to do until such time when when you need to prepare the SEEP. And there are plethora of other examples, such as untraceable and uncontactable customers. Again, as Aji mentioned, quite reasonably, you will probably start looking into them in BAU. So my question almost is it not worth preparing the solvent exit plan in parallel to the solvent exit analysis, and keep both of them updated as you go along, subject to that minimum assurance requirement of 3 yearly reviews. And from an operational sense, that might also make a little bit more sense, because when solvent exit becomes likely, there is a lot going on. And would you rather focus on a plan that is already pre-prepared and just roll it out? Or do you want to, pick up the pen then and prepare, a brand new plan that you may not have thought about in the past? So, the decision is yours. But there is, perhaps doing the SEEP in parallel with the SEA is probably, more sensible practice.
Thanks, India. And I think one of the other things to say here is, when you're saying as solvent exit becomes more likely, people and resources will be stretched in different directions. One of the big barriers often from a wind down perspective in the recent past we've seen is that one of the barriers is the regulatory authorities themselves often aren't happy with what firms are putting forward. So if you've already done that work and you've already received that assessment from those authorities, then that's a significant barrier that you basically eliminated as part of the process, which should make things much smoother when push comes to shove. So we basically now just covered some of the most complex, or hopefully we've covered some of the most complex elements of solvent exit analysis. And obviously you've just covered there around where that solvent exit execution plan comes into things. So just looking forward as we move towards implementation of Solvent Exit next year, what would you say are the most sort of important next steps for firms? What should they be focusing on and getting on with as we move towards implementation?
Thank you, Freddie. So that is so in the last minute, really quickly, I think there are three things that firms can start thinking about, straight away. Decide when to start. So as Aji alluded to, we're already working with a couple of firms on this matter now, and their plan, for instance, is to get this signed off as a part of their 31st of December recovery plan sign off by the board. And the thinking behind this is, they'd like to concentrate on, bigger changes such as, Basel 3.1 and SDDT, whichever one is applicable next year, without being distracted by the requirement to produce a solvent exit plan. So, others may disagree, others may want to do everything together, and that's fine, but decide when to start. The second one is to be able to focus on the most complex areas first. And as we have covered in this presentation, resources and costs, barriers and risks, and communication plan, by far three of the most important and complex and time-consuming areas of the solvent exit analysis. And once you start delving into this, I think you'll find that the rest of the other areas kind of fall in place. It'll probably help you answer a lot of questions, that you might be attempting to answer without much of a background, previously. So, that's definitely something that you might want to think about first, the complex areas. And finally, prepare to take action in an agile manner. So as Aji alluded to, it's entirely reasonable for for you to end up with some actions that you can start taking straight away. As an example, ensuring that your customer details and your customer contact numbers, are up to date and they're kept up to date, as you go along. So, quite plausibly, you might want to start doing that exercise now. So again, as and when, these things come to light, please do take action so that and I think you'll find that you're in a much better position to implement the SCA by the time we get to the 1st of October 2025. It's a long way away now, but, time flies quickly. So with my apologies for running over by 2 minutes, and with my thank yous to Freddie and Aji, that is what we wanted to say, to share with you as a part of today's webinar. So what we're going to do now is we're going to pause and see if there are any questions coming through. There's one. Hold on. Okay, fine. So the first question is, how does the solvent exit interact with other regulations that are currently on the road? That's a good question. So solvent exit SS24. So you'd find that it's so Freddie alluded to its close connections with the recovery plan. So SS917, which is the recovery plan supervisory statement, is due to go through a refresh, and I think a new version is coming into place on the 3rd of March next year. So definitely both need to be read in parallel with each other. And if you read the policy statement, which was published in parallel with SS224, you'd find that I think the regulator is okay for the solvent exit to be a part or an appendix, material appendix to the recovery plan itself. So, so the SS917, or be it, the refresh of it on the 3rd of March, will remain in place. It sits before the solvent exit proceedings kick off. So obviously the firm will first try to recover, and if that fails, you will exit. So clearly there's a chronology over there. So that sits where it sits, and solvent exit would follow recovery planning. So that is one. And secondly, I guess SS321, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this was the PRA's approach to supervising new banks that was published some time ago. And I think and one of the chapters spoke about solvent exit. Now, I suspect it was chapter 5, but I could be mistaken. But one thing to bear in mind is that this chapter is effectively being replaced by the more granular SS224. So I think what you'll find is that if you look at the forward-looking or the future version of SS321, you'll find that the section on solvent exit is much shorter, and it must refer to a lot of what SS24 is saying, where things haven't been cut out. Now, this particular SS321, it would have referred to solvent exit as a solvent wind down plan, and I think a lot of the guidance over there would have been a little bit more high level and a lot less granular than SS224, and that is one change that firms have to implement. I think there could well be some feelings that just updating, like, rolling forward the solvent wind down will probably enable you to, fully comply with SS224. I think what you'll find is that, yes, rolling forward the solvent wind down, if you do have one, is a good step, is a great step to help with compliance with SS24, but it will probably not take you all the way. Definitely on areas where a lot of research and a lot of focus needs to be put in, such as the areas that Freddie and Aji spoke about earlier today. So in summary, if you're relying on that particular chapter of SS321 to think about your solvent wind down or your solvent exit, move on to SS224. Look at that as a replacement to that, and everything else would probably be BAU. Freddie, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, all I'd say is two things. One, you've obviously got, and India's outlined in some detail, the published guidance and the links with the published guidance. But one of the reasons why I draw the thematic link between, that Dear CEO letter on recovery planning and solvent exit is that the mood music from the PRA, and indeed I think there is even a sentence in the solvent exit guidance, is around linking to a degree solvent exit with recovery. So from a more sort of thematic perspective, I think when supervision are looking at solvent exit, they'll be situating it in that kind of RRP ecosystem. And then the one other thing is that I used to work at the Bank of England, and therefore didn't get that stuck into some of the FCA more FCA focused publications. But I think there is quite a lot of read across, because the FCA and FCA firms do have spent in the recent past a lot more time on things like wind down than banks or building societies necessarily have. There's quite a lot of read across there in terms of, for example, the thematic reviews that the FCA have conducted on wind down, and some of the feedback that the FCA is providing there. That sort of feedback may well be applicable and should be considered by banks and building societies going forward as they implement their solvent exit plan. So that's just all that I would add.
Thank you. Thank you, Freddie. There's been a live question that has come in. Another one. So this is around, hold on. Solvent exit analysis is due this October. When is the plan due? So I think solvent exit analysis is due next October, on the 1st of October 2025. So that's when the SEA needs to be, fully in place, and all the arrangements around it needs to have been agreed and signed off by the board, and put into place in this document. But the solvent exit execution plan is not due until such time when the board or whoever the oversight committee is for solvent exit decides that solvent exit is now likely. So that way the solvent exit may never be due, but a lot of the analysis that you would reasonably expect to do as a part of your solvent exit execution plan is probably, you'll find that you're already doing a lot of that as a part of the solvent exit analysis. So the decision is yours, as I said, as to whether to have the solvent exit and the execution plan ready, both of them ready for the 1st of October 2025, or to just deal with the solvent exit analysis now, and wait until solvent exit becomes likely to then pick up the pen and do the rest of the plan. So that is hopefully that hopefully covers the question. Okay, I think there are a couple more that have come. We only have time for one more. Aji, you have this question, don't you? You're on mute.
Technology, it's always a struggle. So we got this really interesting question, and it says, for those not familiar with solvent exit planning, how does it interact with the resolvability assessment framework and the recovery plan? What is the difference between this that adds the other two? What is the difference between this that the other two don't?
Okay, so the recovery. So thank you, Aji. So let's tackle the recovery plan first. So solvent exit. So logically, solvent exit would follow when you cannot recover anymore, or your recovery actions, have not been able to bring you up to, a position when BAU can be resumed. So once your recovery actions fail, you kick on. You kick off, solvent exit, and then there is a very clear chronology and a very logical chronology here. So, you would obviously undertake, your stress testing as a part of your ICAP and ILAP. And at the back of that stress testing, you'll have management actions that helps you come out of that stress and, put everything else in order so that, BAU can resume. Now, there could obviously be stresses that are very similar, very severe, that takes you very close to your point of non-viability. And that's the point when, perhaps some of your management actions may not be strong enough. So you kick off some of your recovery actions. So looking at it that way, if your management actions in relation to your stress testing hasn't been as successful as you would have liked it to, start off thinking of your recovery actions. Now, if you cannot recover, i.e. your recovery actions have been unsuccessful, then it's solvent exit. So you cannot recover. You now need to exit the market in a way that doesn't quite disrupt the ecosystem where you're operating. So there's a very clear chronology there that solvent exit actually sits after the recovery plan, and recovery plan would generally and very logically follow a firm's inability to get out of stress, and as with the firm continuing its downward trajectory. In terms of resolvability assessment, so I think the requirement stays, and solvent exit needs to be viewed as only one way of exiting the market. So there could be other ways by which firms might end up exiting the market. It could be something. So if it's something as simple or severe even as insolvency procedures. So the firm can declare that they're done and they're filing for insolvency, and then the insolvency practitioner would come in and unpick your assets and liabilities as and when you go along. So that is one option. If in terms of resolution failing or likely to fail, so that once you undertake valuations based on that kind of a scenario, the Bank of England might even use their resolution powers to intervene. So again, solvent exit needs to be looked at an avenue for exit, but there are other avenues, be it resolution or insolvency that might still be effective. Freddie, anything to add over there?
Just, I'm conscious we've got 90 seconds, so I'm going to do 30 seconds if I can. And it's just to say, when you're talking about recovery plan, and something actually I probably should have pulled out in the section talking about solvent exit indicators, is that if you've got an ecosystem where you've got different recovery planning triggers and solvent exit triggers, what we've seen in the past when looking at clients from a wind down perspective, but there's going to be clear read across from a solvent exit perspective as well, is it just needs to be really clear and defined as to what the trigger is directing the firm towards. Is it recovery? Is it solvent exit? Is it something else? Because sometimes if you're seeing those in sort of as a broader whole, you sort of start to lose track of what indicator is for what, and that's really important to be clear, not just for the senior decision makers, but also for the regulators as well.
Excellent, thank you, Freddie. Brilliant. So with that, we must thank you for your time this Thursday morning. And there are a few more questions that I can see in the chat box. I'm sorry we weren't able to come to them today, but we'll definitely get back to you on those over the next few days. Well, thank you very much for your time, and I'm sure we'll see you shortly.